Good morning, church family. Hope you're having a great Friday morning, getting ready for the weekend. But first, I hope you've read 2 Samuel chapter 5. That's the book we are in today and the chapter as we read through the Bible. And today we see that David is installed as king over Israel. And it's very interesting what we see in this one chapter. Check out what happens in the first few verses. Then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, "Behold, we are your bone and flesh. In times past, when Saul was king over us, it was you who led out and brought in Israel. And the Lord said to you, you shall be shepherd of my people Israel, and you shall be prince over Israel." So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David as king over Israel. You see, Saul represented what the people wanted, right? Remember in earlier passages, we saw that the people demanded a king, a human king, and they got King Saul, and that did not work out well for them. Saul was a flawed individual, and he was troubled, and we saw how that worked out in his life, and even him attempting to kill David, and David not doing the same back to Saul. Here in this chapter, we see just that stark contrast between the man God wanted versus the man the people wanted. And so many times we are just so fixated on what we want rather than what God wants that it does not work out well for us. And we see that in Israel's past here. Now David is made king, and he is God's man for the job. He's going to use David in a mighty way, but he is still just a man. We see in the remainder of this chapter a couple of things that David does. We do see that as he sets up his rule and his reign, and he is in Jerusalem, that he takes concubines and wives for himself, which is not something that God wanted him to do in that moment. It's something that is not looked highly upon in the eyes of God. So he did go the wrong way as it relates to that. But then we see as he battles the Philistines a little later in this chapter, we do see that he inquires of God how to defeat the Philistines, who are now very interested in what's going on with David. Now that all the kind of the unrest between him and Saul is kind of over, now David is king. The Philistines are now starting to see what they can do to maybe get an upper hand on Israel. David inquires of the Lord, as we all should before any battle, and the Lord gives him direction on how to defeat the Philistines, not once but twice. One time attacking them, and then the next time attacking them from the rear side. So just knowing those little details God gave David, gave him an upper hand, and we see an insight into the heart of David. But again, he was still just a man. And so when we see those things in the passages we read, as we read the Bible, we have to know, yes, these are men and women used by God, but we do see their flaws. And so now, as we continue to read on Monday, we will see what happens next as David is now king over Israel. Let this be an encouragement to us to trust God, his direction in our life, who he wants to use as leadership in our lives, how he leads us in our purpose in our life, and never settle for what makes sense to human beings in our own flesh, in our own minds, but settle in and rest in and lean into what God has for us, even when it makes no sense whatsoever. I pray that you embrace those truths today and have an amazing weekend. We'll see you next time.